You're very welcome. Welcome to Abingdon Peace Group. It's lovely that you're here with us. And I hand over to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tony. And thank you all of you for joining us. So I'm going to share my screen and just show a little, a few slides as I'm talking. Just because I think it's quite good for you to be able to kind of focus on as I talk, because there's quite a lot of information, and it's easier for me to talk if I know that you can actually see what's there. As you can see from the two logos there, I'm actually still with the Acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy, and I'm on this steering group of ICAN. Acronym was one of the key organizations at an early stage that kind of brought out the need to go for a multilaterally negotiated treaty to ban and require the elimination of nuclear weapons, which was a little bit different from the Nuclear Weapon Convention with all bells and whistles that had been kind of on the civil society agenda for a long time, but which was kind of structured and was, was viewed and, in the way that it was treated both by civil society and by the governments, including in the UN. It was assumed that it would have to be negotiated in a forum such as the Conference on Disarmament, or else be subject to the veto of the nuclear armed states on the UN Security Council. And so it was not possible to get liftoff on that. ICAN itself, and you can see the original logo there, which actually they drew directly from CND and some of our early, so it was founded in Australia by a group of doctors and feminist peace activists, essentially, in 2007. And because of the connections that they were wanting to make, they used this wonderful broken missile logo that actually was something that Peter Kennard had actually done for CND way back in the 80s, when we were opposing cruise missiles and Trident and so on. And when I personally was down at Greenham Common and, going to Lynette's for baths and things like that. And so one of the things that I want to be talking about here is actually that trajectory, because this, I'm not the leader. We used to have a saying at Greenham, that the stars are all in the sky. We have no leaders. We are all responsible, and we take part at different places in our different movements, in our different countries. And so, as I'll show a little later in slides, this treaty actually goes right back 75 years. It goes back to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it was built by civil society from that time onwards. And it won't be possible to show and name all those different organizations, but I'll hope to bring in to this talk about the treaty some of those key elements. So this treaty, and it was actually negotiated in the UN General Assembly. And that was part of our strategy. It was part of the strategy with which I approached friends from Australia who were at a meeting at the UN and said, I have this idea for the next stage that we can take. And it's to try to get a treaty that will ban nuclear weapons under international humanitarian law. So it was kind of drawing from the experience of the landmines and cluster munitions. And of course, they'd been thinking and talking about along those lines. And in fact, the name ICAN was dreamed up by this wonderful Malaysian doctor Dr. McCoy, not from Star Trek. His first name was Ron, and his son, in fact, is a doctor in London and one of the leaders in MedAct. So again, you see these connecting up. But he deliberately chose that name, ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, very much kind of building on the work of the growing humanitarian disarmament campaign that had been campaigns that had been launched first to ban landmines, then cluster munitions. So we used a series of, from 2010 onwards, we got key humanitarian commitments made in the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime in the review conference of that year, 2010. And built from then on. And we insisted that as civil society, as ICAN, so I was kind of doing heavy lifting to actually get funding and a staff to establish a main sort of activist and diplomatic hub, as we called it then. It became the headquarters for ICAN, but that's not really how we thought about it at the beginning. It was to be a key diplomatic hub in Geneva to work on the diplomats, while we were also having doctors and then increasing numbers of scientists fanning out around the world. And I was very involved in that because I'd also done a lot of work on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty a couple of decades earlier, or decade and a half earlier. So we demanded that these negotiations must not be able to be vetoed by the nuclear armed states, who were the problem states as far as disarmament was concerned, and particularly nuclear disarmament. And so it kind of evolved through a series of steps that I won't really bore you with now, because I want to jump to the conclusion. But the conclusion was that in 2016, the UN First Committee, which is their Disarmament and Security Committee, very important it links those two, passed a resolution overwhelmingly that then was passed overwhelmingly by the UN General Assembly in December of 2016. So actually just after the poor US had to face Trump coming in as their new president. But that resolution called for, and in fact allocated, about 4 weeks of UN time and resources to negotiate in the UN General Assembly, under UN General Assembly auspices. Some of those negotiations actually took place in that huge building. Others took place in a couple of large enough conference rooms there. And it was billed as being a conference to negotiate a legal instrument that would prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. But after those 4 weeks, and we had to be so concentrated, we had this wonderful chair that you can see dressed in white in the middle, who was Elaine White Gomez from, she was an ambassador from Costa Rica. This was very much a negotiation in which civil society from all around the world, from the nuclear armed states, but also increasingly building alliances with, indigenous survivors of not only the Hiroshima and the Japanese survivors of the Hiroshima, well, not only Japanese, of course, as we know, there were quite a lot of different people killed when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, but the indigenous survivors of nuclear testing and production, uranium mining, all of those aspects around nuclear weapons. We made common cause with them. We reached out, we got the global south, the nuclear-free zones that covered Africa and Latin America and so on. We involved all of those, and that was really a kind of very, very important part of what we did. And so we got this treaty. And so, this was built by a reframing, and it was a reframing that connected in with the climate issue, both the current climate issue and the destruction of of the planet, but also a centrally important climate issue that scientists had brought to our attention in the late 70s, early 80s, about nuclear winter and the destruction of the planet if nuclear weapons were actually used. But they updated those studies and they found that actually it would take only a small fraction of nuclear weapons existing. Now, today we have about 13,400 nuclear weapons in the world. There were about 50,000 in the 80s, when I was at Greenham. But it wouldn't take those thousands. It would take even what was called a limited or a regional nuclear war, for example, somewhere like India, Pakistan, and it would only take 50 of the, so less than half of the nuclear weapons held by each of those two nuclear armed countries. And you would get this, climate destruction effect called nuclear winter, causing famine around the world. And it's really important to recognize how that would be part of it. But we also generated a lot more studies looking at the risks. Because again, we had people actually, saying to us, oh, but everybody knows that nuclear weapons are risky. But, we had the UK, leaders, but also a lot of UK academics saying to us, yeah, but they're not meant to be used. They're meant to be deterrents. And in fact, in this country, as you know, we're not even supposed to talk about having nuclear weapons. We're told that, and unfortunately, the media kind of follows on with this ridiculous, language chicanery of always talking about, the UK's independent nuclear deterrent. Well, the question of whether it deters or not is a question that has to be asked. It's a question that has to be looked at. It's naming a dog cat doesn't actually mean that the dog can meow. And that's the case with weapons. You name it a deterrent when you stop people asking the fundamental question of what does this do? Does this, weapon of mass annihilation actually deter? By what, in what terms? So we got a lot more academics kind of looking at those again from a lot of different perspectives and looking at how we could actually have a much better form of deterrence without any nuclear weapons at all. And in fact, that most countries in the whole world have deterrence as part of their defense strategies with no nuclear weapons. And you have even some countries that don't use direct military involvement. So we brought all of this together. We reminded people of what nuclear weapons did. And we invited the, hibaksha, people who had suffered from nuclear weapons. But the end point of all of that is that we actually got the treaty. It was adopted by 122 states who are UN member states, and then it was opposed by one and abstention one. And we see here Setsuko Thurlow, who was a very special participant in this, she was 13-year-old girl at school in Hiroshima when the bomb was dropped, and her speaking was absolutely extraordinary throughout the whole. Well, we made contact with her very early on, and her speaking about her experiences, but always linking it to the call for a nuclear ban treaty was the most powerful that we had, and it was so important that we had that. And so the UN General Assembly, the UN General Secretary opened the treaty on September the 20th of 2017. And then we had to just try to sign up the states. And just a correction to Tony, it was the 50th nation, the 50th state happened to be Honduras. The last three were Honduras from Latin America, Jamaica from the Caribbean, and Nauru from the Pacific. But it includes states from all countries, including Europe, or all parts of the world, including Europe, but didn't include the nuclear armed states. That's an important thing. That is why we have to be having these kinds of meetings. But the 50th state deposited its instrument of ratification with the Secretary General at the UN on the 24th of October, and then starts the 90-day countdown for the treaty actually becoming international law. And this is crucial to recognize. And so what does this treaty? And here is the treaty in a handy little blue. The UN allows us, because it's a UN treaty, to use their UN blue color. And we've printed up the treaty. We in ICAN here in the UK, and ICAN in a lot of different countries, and in the main languages, for example. And here is this amazing treaty with all its parts, as treaties have to have. And it is going to become international law on the 22nd of January. And that's what we really have to celebrate, but also the next stage of work, and particularly another stage of work for here in the UK is going to get started. So it has a really strong humanitarian preamble, explicitly recognizing the humanitarian consequences and, you know, all of these issues, and the calling for the effective participation of women as well as men in all aspects of nuclear disarmament and peace building. This is very important. We worked with WILF, Women's International League, with the Irish and Swedish were very supportive in taking these kinds of issues forward, and also continual education. And I'm actually going to want to read just one paragraph out of this, but I think it's an important one because it kind of encapsulates this in the treaty's words. Cognizant that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons cannot be adequately addressed, transcend national borders, pose grave implications for human survival, the environment, socio-economic development, the global economy, food security, and the health of current and future generations, and have a disproportionate impact on women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation. This is powerful stuff, and it is enshrined in a UN treaty that is becoming international humanitarian law. Now, why do I call it a feminist humanitarian treaty? And it's because from the very beginning of ICAN's origins, and, you know, and I'm proud to have been able to feed myself, you know, feed things that we learned going right back to Greenham, and, you know, women who came to us, and then talks that we helped to raise money and organize for Aboriginal anti-nuclear activists from Australia, from the Pacific, Indigenous people from Western Shoshone, where the UK carried out its underground nuclear testing for many, many years until the early 90s. They came to Greenham and fanned out, you know, around the country, talking about these issues, so that it wasn't, Greenham was not just about stopping the US cruise missiles at, you know, coming into this country, but actually we learned, we listened, we learned, and we started applying it, these you know, these experiences and what we heard in many other ways. And I personally, when I did finally leave Greenham at the time of the INF Treaty in 1987, I started putting my energies into banning nuclear testing. And that's actually how I got on top of all this sort of knowledge and experience of what you do with treaties and all of that. So it was actually, and not being afraid, not being ashamed, not apologizing for actually recognizing that love and caring and human security and environmental security and respect have to be at the center of all our political work, our thought and our action on peace. That peace is not an end thing. It is something we build and we keep building. Just like, in fact, disarmament is always something that we have to achieve, but then we have to keep on making sure that they're not bringing the next deadly, horrible, high-tech, you know, engines of annihilation. We also brought in, through the humanitarian side, you know, not all this magic realism thinking of the governments that have become so reliant on on weapons, if nuclear weapons in this country, but also all the other weapons that they have to have and they build and they spend huge amounts of money on. Let's actually look at the real factual and foreseeable impacts, the risks, the dangers, the consequences, all those things that the governments who wield these weapons don't want anyone to think about. We put it at the heart of the campaigning. And that prioritizing of sustainability, people, planet, diversity, climate, biodiversity, that really making these connections, and the connections are made in the treaty. And thinking about human security, supporting and valuing the needs and security of, we did use that language, victims. I know that it's more popular now to talk about survivors, but there were victims as well who never survived. And it's actually recognizing that countries that wield weapons have got to take account of who they are harming, when and why. And in fact, the actual people who've died and continue to die from nuclear weapons are people who have no nuclear weapons. They have no access to nuclear weapons. They're not part of these strategies of deterrence and all of that sort of stuff. But they are very much the victims, and it is an ethical choice by governments and therefore by us as citizens of what our governments use for our security. And then the next one is, we do recognize the military and industrial interests of producers. The military, I call them the MEBAs, the military, industrial, bureaucratic, academic, people who actually rely for all kinds of ways in jobs and finances and profiteering and all those sorts of things. But we do not prioritize or privilege the MEBAs who make the weapons above the needs of everybody else around the world. And we don't prioritize, we don't privilege and prioritize the nuclear armed states and how they look at the world. We actually listen to everybody else in the world. And then the next couple of slides actually verbatim give you the text of the key Article 1 prohibitions. Each state, and I'm not going to read it because you can see it in front of you, I hope, but what it basically directly prohibits and explicitly prohibits is all of the activities that could enable anyone, not just states, anyone, to acquire, use, or threaten to use nuclear weapons. And that's really important. So it has those key prohibitions. This is carrying on that same Article 1 explicitly, and for the first time ever in any legal instrument dealing with nuclear weapons, the use and even the threatening to use nuclear weapons or nuclear explosive devices. And the reason why we have both of those in is so that states can't say, oh, well, I have a nuclear explosive device in order to carry out some kind of peaceful purpose, because that's how they thought about it in the 1960s. They had things like peaceful nuclear explosions. They actually allowed that in the founding non-proliferation treaty that got superseded 20 years later. But the point is, this is why we kind of covered all angles. E is incredibly important, and I'm going to return to that a bit later, but it is actually also prohibiting anyone within state parties. And as a treaty, what this means is the state party, the government that has signed and ratified, brings in its entire country. And unless a future government actively unsigns and pulls out of the treaty, and we know that can happen, but it actually, well, with leaders other than Trump and Kim Jong-un, it happens very, very rarely. Once a government has taken on a treaty, they then also implement it in their national laws. And that's important because under this E, it means that nobody covered by a state party and the state party's laws can carry on assisting or encouraging or inducing in any way anyone, so not just a state, but anyone, a non-state actor, a company, a bank even. And that's really important. And of course, then you also can't seek or receive. This G is also very important, especially for Scotland and the NATO countries, the 5 countries that station and deploy, in fact, the nuclear weapons for another country. Well, at least in Scotland's terms, the Scottish government is completely opposed. The Scottish people, well, a large number of people all over the UK actually opposed to nuclear weapons, and a growing number want the UK to sign this treaty. But Scotland is in a particular further case, and that G actually relates to that and to the nuclear endorsing countries. Then this is a basic article that has 2 different ways, 2 different pathways for a state like the UK or, Israel or India, Pakistan, Russia, China, France, US, any of those 9 nuclear armed states. They can choose whether they do what South Africa did when it got rid of its nuclear weapons, as it was getting rid of apartheid after massive amounts of civil society, activism, in South Africa and also around the world. The then white South African government, still an apartheid government, decided itself to eliminate everything. And only then did it publicize that and invite the International Atomic Energy Agency, etc., to verify that it no longer had nuclear weapons nor capability to make them. And then it joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1992. Or the alternative that a country could do, a country like UK could sign tomorrow, if only we could persuade them to, and then negotiate a timetable with the states parties and with international verification and so on, about how long it would take and what would be required. And then it could get assistance by all the states parties in actually eliminating its nuclear weapons and becoming nuclear free. And they would do that in accordance with an agreed timetable. That would be different from, because one size doesn't fit all. The UK's arsenal is a very different size from North Korea's, is a very different size from India, Pakistan, or France, or China, or the US and Russia, who are the largest. And then it has these various things, like national implementation is this national law. And the entry into force is the wonderful thing that now we've achieved the entry into force provisions. And as I said, the 90-day countdown has started so it's not, the UN doesn't have to ratify this treaty. Just again, to just clarify something that Tony says, the treaty, the UN Secretary General is what's known as the depository of the treaty. So this treaty is a UN treaty, and the UN is responsible for safeguarding and essentially implementing this treaty. But the treaty itself, the states parties have to build in the correct forms, and this can be done evolutionarily. We couldn't fit it all into the negotiations all in one go for a variety of reasons, and I can answer questions on that. But anyway, but what happens on the 22nd of January actually is the 90 days are up, the treaty enters into legal force under international law and international humanitarian law. And I just put up this picture also to kind of show that was the team of us, really, the staff and the 10 states that were, the 10 non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, some of which, like the doctors and the Religions for Peace, actually represented lots of affiliates all around the world. And a couple of them, you'll see me, it was very cold that day. They're from quite small organizations that had actually done quite a lot of the heavy lifting and strategizing with ICAN to make this happen. So we were a variety of people. But this is a picture I love most because it's a human side of it. This was in Dublin in 2014 with Setsuko, my partner Hina, a few of you know, and Kathleen, who always accompanies Setsuko. She had her 40th birthday, by the way, at the gates of Faslane as part of Faslane 365. So she's an absolutely long-standing feminist peace activist in her own right. And there we are. Setsuko, we had all, well, I and Setsuko were part of a conference to get invited by some Irish groups and the Irish Foreign Ministry to persuade the Irish politicians to enable Ireland to become part of a core group doing the real early pushing for this treaty, knowing that this would cause a lot of pressure from the UK, possibly from France as well, and maybe some of the NATO states within the European Union, probably the US as well, and so on. This was the kind of thing that was having to take place in a lot of different places, with or without the Guinness. You know, groups of people working with survivors and and working all in our different ways behind the scenes, you know, in academic groups, in civil society groups, in humanitarian groups, just really, you know, with parliamentarians. We worked a lot with parliament. We had lots of different connections and with different kind of parliamentary parliamentarians in lots of different countries at all levels. So now we get to where we're actually talking about what we're doing about this. So the first thing is, what are the implications for the UK? Well, first and foremost, the TPNW, we call it that, but you can call it the Nuclear Ban Treaty. It makes nuclear weapons illegal under international law. That means no more excuses. It doesn't accept anyone saying, oh, well, you know, we only have them in order to be deterrents, so we'll just keep them, and we promise not to use them, which is kind of what countries like the UK have done before. No more excuses. They are illegal. However, we have to recognize as civil society that under international law, the states that don't sign a treaty are not actually legally bound by the international courts as such. But nevertheless, this treaty will increase massively, I think, the political legal pressures on those states. And we have some examples of that. France, for example, carried on doing atmospheric testing in the Pacific over a decade later, after the partial test ban treaty had been adopted and by the UK, US and Russia, and then opened up to be multilateral. And yet Australia, New Zealand, and a host of Pacific states took France to court in the International Court of Justice for violating the norms that the partial test ban treaty represented against any kind of nuclear testing in in the atmosphere, underwater, or outer space. And instead of brazening it out, France actually in 1974, when they were due to appear before the ICJ on this, France actually entirely ended its atmospheric testing program. Similarly with North Korea. North Korea has never signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but yet there was massive public and political and diplomatic pressure on them when they conducted tests after many states in the world had signed and ratified the CTBT. Yet the CTBT has not actually entered into force, partly because a country like North Korea and also China and the US have a veto in that treaty. We learned that lesson. We didn't give any vetoes in our treaty. And then, of course, there's the more recent use of Syria and the Chemical Weapons Treaty. Again, Syria didn't join the Chemical Weapons Convention before chemical weapons were explicitly used. We're still not absolutely certain whether this was a governmental use or not. But the point was that the pressure for having violated this multilateral treaty that bans chemical weapons was such that Syria had to join immediately, and the government had to actually undertake steps to try and find out who did use them and so on. So having a treaty doesn't overnight mean that no one will ever use it. We have to be clear about that. We have to be vigilant to stop anyone using it. But it changes all the political, normative, and indeed the legal conditions surrounding that. And it means that collective international action will be brought to bear against any country that violates, particularly through use. And so basically what we can say now is that from 22nd of January, something that a lot of us have striven for in different kinds of political means is now going to be the case, which is that any use of nuclear weapons is in fact going to be understood. We all know it, but this is not a moral treaty, this is a legal treaty. So it actually takes that morality that we knew that any use of nuclear weapons is a crime against against humanity, whether in war or in not war. This treaty makes that a legal fact too. And finally, this really important issue that the prohibitions and provisions do bind all states parties. And it also extends through their national implementation and legislation to citizens, companies, etc. And they're required to implement all provisions. And that includes, and I'm going to flag this up again because it's so important, not to assist, encourage, or induce anyone to engage in any acts that are prohibited to a state party under this treaty. So this leads straight into here, which is what we're going to do about it. And we've got what, 70 days still to go before 22nd of January. So we're actually working as ICAN partners here in the UK, which includes a lot of the major, CND is in it, and Greenpeace, and a lot of faith groups are from different, not just Christian. And there's a very strong group in Scotland and so on. And, Trident Ploughshares and, all sorts of different kinds of groups have chosen, MedAct and, humanitarian groups have chosen to be part of ICAN partners. Now, we'll all of us in our different ways be doing things, and we're really encouraging people to do a lot of things locally. We know that Scottish rejection of nuclear weapons, given that Scotland is coming up to an election in May of 2021, may be crucial in kind of shifting the situation in the UK. But here in the rest of the UK as well, we've actually got to bring this pressure. We've really got to use whatever we can. Now, we tried so hard to get letters in The Guardian and The Times and all those sort of things. Thank goodness for the faith leaders getting their wonderful letter and an article into The Observer a week after, or a couple of weeks after. But we know it's really difficult in this country to actually get the media nationally to take on this issue. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. But we can do some of that ourselves. Banners over bridges in your own area, local COVID safe demos. Also, we're going to be trying to look at, the big, paid for content, both in ads, and you might be able as a group to put paid for content kind of congratulating the treaty, or announcing that nuclear weapons as of 22nd of January are illegal under international law, and then calling on the UK government to join the treaty, get rid of Trident, and join the majority of countries around the world in implementing and verifying, and use Aldermaston. You're not that far from Aldermaston and Burfield. Use Aldermaston and Burfield to dismantle nuclear weapons and to do the verification and to work with the treaty on that. So it's those kinds of things. We're even looking at trying to raise money for, those big hoardings. What are they called? Billboards. you know, trying to get some billboards in key locations, but they're fairly expensive. So, you know, we're trying to raise some money, but, you know, already a lovely group of people just phoned me last week, and the musicians for nuclear peace and disarmament, or the musicians for peace and disarmament, I think, they just sent a check that came today for £500. That's a billboard somewhere. So we can do that. Whatever you do, use the treaty in all your activism. If you're going to do some nonviolent direct action, link it to the treaty. Actually take, you know, a copy of the treaty. You can download it, or you can print it out for yourself. You can download it, you know, from a printer. Pop it in your rucksack. Take it with you, because if you get arrested, that comes to court with you. Also, let's make links with climate, and let's make links with the young people. And then after the 22nd of January, what will it take to bring UK government to sign? And we've got to strategize about all those issues. Now, this slide is just really underlining that point about the connection between nuclear and climate destruction, because I think we have to win these two. They're both urgent. We have to win these two. And then the final kind of real slide here is really saying there are legal things we can do. If you get arrested, you can make sure that the treaty comes into the court with you. Do it at, you know, key places, you know, bases and places like that matter. But the financial stuff, the divestment stuff, use the fact that that is now going to make it almost impossible. You know, banks are very risk averse. So this is really important. We can actually put lids on the money going to nuclear weapons in this country from other countries that have become state parties, some of which are European. We can, you know, Don't Bank on the Bomb does research on that, and we can also do further research. And the same with production. You know, something like Rolls-Royce contributes to the nuclear weapons, but it actually probably gets a lot more money from what it does on aircraft and what it does with cars and those sorts of things. So, you know, we can work on that as ICAN partners to do that research. The municipal, a lot more cities. I'm working now on Brighton and Hove. You know, there's people working on Hackney now. Edinburgh already. Manchester was the first in this country. And even counties. What was it? Stirlingshire? No, it was one of the Scottish counties passed resolutions saying that they will align with the treaty and try to implement it. Of course, the disrupting deployments, and a real big shout out for Nukewatch and, you know, everybody who gets out there with Nukewatch. Let's keep highlighting the humanitarian impacts, highlighting the risks on the roads when the warheads are moving. That's really important. And the jobs issue, which I talked about. I'm going to move past this really quite quickly. It's a nice little quote from Caroline Lucas. And the final one, and I'll just leave it there, is going back to that slide that I talked about, because the most fundamental thing is your ideas. And I'll leave it there, because I'm sure you've got ideas and questions, and I gather that we don't have to stop dead on 1 hour, that the organizers here thought that it would probably stretch for a little while longer. So let's have some questions, some ideas, some comments, please. But yes, I can, you can, we can.
Yeah.